Hello, my dear friends and viewers, and welcome back to my main YouTube channel. Zdravo, moje ime je Rumba Daljan i dobrodošli nazad na moj YouTube kanal. A danas želim da pričam uspon I pad Slobodana Milosevića. So today we're going to talk about the rise and fall of Slobodan Milosevic, the traitor to the Serbian and Yugoslav people who started the civil wars in ex-Yugoslavia. So Milosevic was obviously the leader or so-called the first president of Serbia, and also the president of Yugoslavia, or the president of the Socialist Republic of Serbia when it was a part of communist Yugoslavia or Tito's Yugoslavia. So Milosevic was responsible for the genocide committed in Bosnia and Kosovo, and he was responsible for starting the wars in Bosnia and Kosovo and Croatia. So, and he was also placed on trial. But before I get into those details and what led to his rise and downfall, I'm going to talk about a little bit of his biography. So, Milosevic was born on August 20th, 1941, and Bodrurevic, that's in Serbia. So he was born in Serbia in 1941. So that was during the time of the Nazi occupation of Yugoslavia and Serbia, and so lived through most of World War II, where he was a kid or infant, basically. And so his parents were also his parents also had committed suicide. So he probably had his mother committed suicide in 1972, and then his father committed suicide in 1962. So, and also Milosevic had a brother, which his older brother, which his name was Borislav. He was also the Yugoslav ambassador to Russia, and he also spoke Russian and Serbian, basically. And also during that time of the Tito's Yugoslavia, Slobodan Milosevic's brother, had went with Tito to Soviet Union to meet up with Leonid Brezhnev, who was the general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And then also he would also help Tito to translate whatever Brezhnev was saying to Tito, because Brezhnev had spoke Russian. And so also Milosevic's father had also spoken Serbian and Russian. So he spoke both Serbian and Russian. And also his father was an Orthodox, Serbian Orthodox, uh, or was a member of the Serbian Orthodox. And also after the war ended in 1945, Milosevic's parents had divorced, and they went separate, their separate ways. And so Milosevic's brother had also served as as a major general in the Yugoslav People's Army. That was the Army of Yugoslavia, one before it collapsed, or communism had collapsed in Yugoslavia and Eastern Europe. And so, as a young adult, Slobodan Milosevic went to the Belgrade University to study law, basically, and that's where he became the head of ideology committee of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia. So he became a member of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia, because the major party of Yugoslavia. Because if you remember, Yugoslavia was a one-party state. For example, like Soviet Union, Sovietsky Savez, basically. And so during that time in university, he befriended Ivan Stampolovich, who was also a Serbian politician, and he would later be killed by Milosevic sometime in 2000. Yeah, in 2000 he would be killed during that time. So this was right after the NATO bombings of Yugoslavia of 1999. And so after he graduated from college in 1966, he had became a, economic advisor to the mayor of Belgrade. And then 5 years later, he became married to his childhood friend. And then they had two kids. That was named Marco, who was Milosevic's son, and then Maria, who was Milosevic's daughter, basically. And so during that era, Milosevic had went to trips to the United States, to Paris and New York. That was basically where he learned how to speak fluent English. And then during his time there, because he was a banker during that time, and then which was one of the largest banks in Yugoslavia, and so that's why he went to New York and London to learn English. And so in the 80s, Milosevic was elected the Belgrade League of Communist City Committee, so he was kind of like in control of Belgrade's Communist Party there. And so also he pursued some of the policies of Alexander Rakovic, who was basically a very famous Serbian-Yugoslav communist during the Tito era, and he decided to pursue his policies. And he wanted to follow the legacy of Rakovic, and he wanted to transform Yugoslavia into a police state, basically, so he could crush the problems of ethnic Albanians in Kosovo. And so basically during that era, Milosevic had stated that Albanians were abusing their power in Kosovo, and then basically that's how they became a problem in Kosovo, basically. Because if you remember, Kosovo was one of the 6 republics of ex-Yugoslavia. And so at that time, when there was a lot of different ethnicities living there. There were ethnic Albanians in Kosovo, and there were ethnic Serbs in Kosovo as well. And so the Albanians had abused their power, and then they were trying to bring separatism in Kosovo, so they could live separately. Serbs could live separately, and Albanians could live separately as well. And so also there was a time in the 80s when Milosevic had got rid of the people in charge of Serbia and Kosovo and Montenegro, and he replaced them with his allies, or his friends, so-called. And then he placed them in power in those countries, or those former republics of Yugoslavia, and they would basically hold the power in those nations or those republics. And so also in 1980, those revolutions were also known as the anti-bureaucratic revolutions. And so Milosevic also gave a speech in 1989. That was basically where he gave a speech to commemorate the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo. That was basically where, if you remember, the Serbs were fighting the Ottomans, and this was before Serbia had fallen under the control of the Ottoman Empire. And so basically, the Ottomans had defeated the Serb army in Kosovo, and that's how Serbia had became under Ottoman occupation. The rest of the Balkans had fallen under the Ottoman influence, and then it would remain under Ottoman influence for 500 years. And so basically, some people in Serbia were standing up against Milosevic because they did not like his policies, and they considered Milosevic as a traitor to the Serbian people, because he basically started the wars and ex-Yugoslavia, particularly in Bosnia and Kosovo, and those wars would cause millions of people's lives. And then in a Slovenian newspaper that was published or that focused on Milosevic had compared him to Italian dictator Mussolini, who was the fascist dictator of Italy during World War II, and he would be killed by the Italian resistance as he fled to when he attempted to flee Italy to prevent himself from being captured. And so, also at that time, that was basically Milosevic had also transformed the Serbian economy from a planned economy to a mixed economy. And that was basically during the free democratic elections in Serbia. Because if you remember, when Yugoslavia broke down, there would be basically free elections and there would be multi-party elections in ex-Yugoslavia. So like multiple parties could take part in the elections. So that was one of the few changes that came to Serbia after the collapse of communism in Yugoslavia. And so also the Milosevic regime had prevented censorship, so like they could block everything that the media was telling the Serbian people, and so that's what his regime was responsible for. And then also he wanted to keep Serbia in Yugoslav orbit. So basically, Serbia cannot break apart from Yugoslavia. And so basically, all the other republics like Croatia, Hrvatska, Slovenia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Macedonia had all declared their independence, but Serbia and Montenegro did not declare their independence, and that would be soon come up with a federation called the State Union of Serbia and Montenegro. The Zajednica države Serbije I Crna Gora. That was basically a federation. That's if you say it from Serbian to English, that's what the translation would be. And so also in the 80s, there was also rebellion in Kosovo. There was a lot of strikes in Kosovo by Albanians against the Serbian Socialist Republic. That was one of the 6 republics of Yugoslavia. And so that's basically where they were against the Serbs, basically. There were a lot of riots in Kosovo throughout the 80s prior to the collapse of Yugoslavia. And so in the 90s, shortly before the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Communist Party or some nations, some republics of the Yugoslavia had abandoned the Communist Party because they basically withdrawn from Milosevic's Yugoslavia, basically. And so basically they wanted to and then also there will also be free elections that would be held in Yugoslavia during that period. And so and then also Milosevic was much different from Gorbachev, because if you remember, Milosevic had violently dissolved Yugoslavia because there would basically be with civil wars would take place in that region. But on the other hand, Gorbachev was much different compared to Milosevic, because Gorbachev had dissolved the Soviet Union peacefully, and the country did not descend into civil war as Milosevic had did to Yugoslavia. And so basically there was no brotherhood and unity in Soviet Union because they had a different beliefs and stuff. So but on the other hand, Milosevic, there will basically be protests held against his regime that would continue throughout most of the 90s, and then that would continue until his removal when he was removed in 2000, a year before he was arrested in 2001, and then he would be placed in The Hague, where he would remain there until 2006 when he died. And so also, and then also he was also responsible for invading uh, Slovenia, because Slovenia had declared their independence, and he did not want Slovenia to withdraw from Yugoslavia. But on the other hand, some nations of Yugoslavia wanted to leave the Federation of Yugoslavia, and then those regions were brutally destroyed, and then there would be a lot of construction in those areas, and particularly in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Croatia, basically. So also, the Republic of Macedonia had seceded in 1991. So this was prior to the invasion of Bosnia, or when the Bosnian War had started in 1992. So there was no war. Slovenia did not go to war after the collapse of Yugoslavia, and so after that, the Milosevic had attacked Bosnia, because basically Milosevic had claimed that Bosnia was illegally proclaimed as an independent state, and that was one of the reasons why the Milosevic regime had attacked Bosnia, and that war would last until 1995. So from 1992 to 1995, and that war would claim the lives of millions. The Bosnian War and other civil wars in ex-Yugoslavia during that period. And so prior to the invasion of April 6, 1992, there was a telephone conversation between the Milosevic and the Bosnian Serb leader or president, Radovan Karadzic, that took place in 1991. That was basically, they were discussing about the prospects of war in Bosnia, or the plans for the war in Bosnia, basically. And so, and then also at the time, that conversation was reported to the Yugoslav premier Ante Markovic, and then he also discredited Milosevic for that conversation, and basically got in trouble for that. Milosevic was a troublemaker, basically. Milosevic was Serbian traitor to the Serbian Yugoslav people. Milosevic je bio izgledajnik do srpsko-jugoslavskog naroda. And so he was he was responsible for the Vukovar. That was basically where a Serbian army was fighting in that city, and that city was brutally destroyed during that time. And so that a lot of towns throughout the Balkan region during that time were destroyed, and they would be soon reconstructed. So that was a Vukovar massacre, and that was organized by Archon's Tigers. That was basically a military unit under Archon. But we'll talk about Archon and potentially in another episode, along with Ratko Mladic and Radovan Karadzic and Vojislav Šešelj. So yeah, we'll talk about those guys in future episodes or in future live streams. And so also at that, there was also some documents saying that that Vojislav Šešelj had claimed that Milosevic was responsible for supporting Vojislav Šešelj's militaries and controlled the Serb forces during the war, and he organized everything basically at the time. And so during his rule in Serbia, the Srebrenica genocide would took place, and that was basically where the Serbs had committed genocide against Bosnian Muslim men and children there, and 8,300 people would be killed, and then ultimately Bosnian War had came to an end in December 1995. That was when they signed the Daytona Agreement. That was basically where they brought an end to the Bosnian War and ex-Yugoslavia, and that would bring an end. And that also the Dayton agreement was signed in Dayton, Ohio. That's in the United States. And so that ultimately brought an end to the Bosnian War, and also the leaders who took part in that agreement included Bill Clinton, who was the president of the United States at the time. And then there was Slobodan Milosevic, who was the president, as you already know. And then there was Frank Tuchman, who was the president of Croatia, and Alija Izetbegovic, who was the president of Bosnia. And so those four leaders had came to Daytona, Ohio, and they signed that agreement, and that brought an end to the Bosnian War. And so also during the wars and the war in Bosnia, almost thousands of Serbs had fled Serbia, and they went to overseas or to Western Europe, and particularly in the United States, to escape the regime of Milosevic, because they did not want to participate in the war in Bosnia or in the ex-Yugoslavia. And so during those times, there would be anti-war movements that soon developed in Serbia, because people had protested against the wars in Bosnia, and they wanted to bring an end to the war in Bosnia, basically. And so they wanted the wars to be ended, and that's what happened during that era. And then soon he would also cause the wars in Kosovo, Rat u Kosovo, and he would also basically become the president of the State Union of Serbia and Montenegro, and that he obtained that position on July 23rd, 1997. And so during his era, the Kosovo War had started in 1998, because that was when Serbs or Albanians were killing Serbs and they were selling their organs, which was one of the main reasons why the war in Kosovo started. And then NATO had started to bomb Yugoslavia. That started on March 24th, 1999, and that killed thousands of Serb people in Yugoslavia. And so also Milosevic was indicated of crimes committed in Bosnia and Kosovo. And then a year later, in 2000, he would ultimately be overthrown by his people, basically, when the presidential elections were held and parliamentary elections were held in Yugoslavia. And so he was overthrown on October 5th, 2000, and then he would be arrested by Yugoslav police on April 1st, 2001, when there was a standoff between police and Milosevic's bodyguards at his villa in Belgrade. And so he was found guilty of abuse. He was suspected of abuse of power and corruption. And his reign has been noted for corruption in Serbia, basically. And so, and then in June of 2001, he would be flown. He would be transported from Tuzul, Bosnia, and then he would be transported to The Hague in the Netherlands. That was where his trial would take place. But his trial had never finished because he died on March 11th, 2006. That was basically where he died. And so he was refused to have a state funeral, but people in his hometown had 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 given him a funeral, so they attended his funeral in his birth town where he was born. And so that's what happened to Milosevic. And there was also some conspiracy theories that Milosevic had also had how to say um, like a surgery or something. I don't know that. I don't know if those reports are true or not because I don't know. That's what I have heard, but I actually don't know if that's what happened. So a lot of people say that Milosevic was a traitor because he started the wars in Yugoslavia, and he was considered the tyrant, the Serb people, basically. So that's how the people of Serbia and ex-Yugoslavia had viewed him, basically. And so at that time, NATO was like placing sanctions on Yugoslavia because, particularly, the wars in Yugoslavia, ex-Yugoslavia, and Bosnia, Kosovo, and then uh, sanctions would be against Yugoslavia would be withdrawn, and then they would be lifted by January 19, 2001. So that was basically after Milosevic was overthrown from power in 2000. So, yeah. And then after the removal of Milosevic in 2000, there would be other people and that would take his place. There would be Vojislav, and there would be Zoran Djindjic, and those men would basically try to do everything in their power to end corruption in Serbia and in Yugoslavia. And so that would ultimately be a failure because Zoran Djindjic, he would be assassinated in 2003 on March 12th, 2003, when one of Arkan's former army lieutenants, I believe, or colonels, had assassinated him in Belgrade, and he was ultimately thrown into jail for killing Zoran Djindjic. So and then that was his plan to end corruption in Yugoslavia, but it turned out to be a failure. So also, when NATO was bombing Yugoslavia, it had damaged a lot of buildings in Belgrade and other parts of Serbia, ex-Yugoslavia, and then also the United States had bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. That was in that part of the city. And so he would also be in that's also some conspiracy saying that they didn't find the body of Milosevic in the same way they didn't find Saddam Hussein's body or Bin Laden's body. I think that's all that's simply not true. So also Milosevic was considered the Hitler of the Balkans by Westerners because he was particularly responsible for the genocide in Bosnia and Kosovo, and that's why the Western media had given him the name the Hitler of the Balkans, and then he would be overthrown in 2000. So, yep. So in my next video or live stream, I plan to talk about not Milosevic, Arkan Ratko Mladic, Radovan Karadzic, Vojislav Šešo, and particularly when the Balkans was under the Ottoman influence and the rise of nationalism and the liberation of the Balkans of the 1800s. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. Hvala na gledaju, prijatan dan I doviđenja. Viđenja.